I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey, lurkers, welcome to this edition of Stab and Gab Sunday. This week we're heading to Weston, Massachusetts in 1904 and looking at the murder of Mabel Page. Mabel Page was the daughter of Edward Page and Elizabeth Adams Page. Edward Page was a Maine native who moved to Boston as a young man and built a fortune. He married Elizabeth Dana Adams in 1855, and they had 5 children. Ruth Ann was the oldest, Mabel was the middle child, and her brother Harold the youngest. There were 2 other children that were born but died young. Mabel attended private schools growing up, and she was well educated in music and art, and became a skilled embroiderer. Her brother Harold graduated from Harvard. At the turn of the 20th century, Edward lost his fortune through bad investments in Southern railroads and Western cattle ranches, and the family moved permanently to what was once their summer home in Weston. The Weston house was originally an estate of 43 acres, but they sold 33 acres off. They had 2 houses prior to the loss of the fortune. They also had a live-in maid named Amy Roberts, who was considered part of the family. Harold and Mabel supported the household, Harold working for the railroad, and Mabel bringing in sewing and embroidery jobs. Mabel, who you'll remember had an excellent education, was engaged at the age of 20, but she and her fiancé decided they shouldn't marry. Her family's opposition was a big factor in that decision. He traveled and eventually married someone else. Mabel remained at home, caring for her sick mother, who ended up dying in 1902. Oddly, and I say that because at the time this was odd, Mabel inherited the house when her mother died. Mabel spent the majority of her time reading, sewing, and embroidering. She rarely made visits and had so little desire for society that few of the neighbors knew her well. She was extremely modest, and it is doubtful if she had spoken to a man other than her father and brother for years, unless it was a tradesman or a railroad station employee. In 1904, Harold was 35 years old and Mabel was 40. Their father, Edward, was 77. Their older sister, Ruth Ann, was a widow and lived in Boston with her children. On Thursday, March 31st, 1904, Harold Page left the house as usual at 7:35 a.m. to catch the train in nearby Auburndale. He arrived at his office at the South Terminal Station at 8:30. Soon after, around 10 a.m., Edward Page went to Auburndale, about 3 miles away, intending to go to Boston. Around 10:30 a.m., the maid, Amy Roberts, left the house to spend the day making calls in Watertown and Cambridge. When Ms. Roberts left, Mabel gave her $1 from her purse in her pocket, and the maid saw a $10 bill in her hand. Mabel was then alone in the house. There were no houses within a 5 or 6 minute walk, and there was no unobstructed view from those houses. So those in the Page house were basically isolated from getting help. Around 11 or 11:30 a.m., Henry Maynard, the driver of the laundry wagon, called and delivered a bundle to Mabel, giving it to her at the rear door and receiving the amount due. He was the last person known to have seen her alive. Around 2 p.m., Edward Page returned home. He had been reading magazines at the Auburndale Library. He was surprised to find the front door unlocked, since he knew his daughter always kept the door locked when he and her brother were away. When he entered, he saw no indication that anyone was home. After some time, he saw a pad of paper lying on the table in the living room. One of the sheets of the pad had been torn off and lay beside the pad on the table. Edward looked at it and saw writing in pencil on the torn sheet. The note said, "Have just heard Harold is hurt and in Massachusetts hospital. Have gone in 12 o'clock. Will leave key at front side door with key of barn stair. Will telephone Mrs. Bennet." Mrs. Bennet was the wife of Judge Bennet, who were neighbors living about a third of a mile away at Cutter's Corner, and they had a telephone. Edward went to check the side door for the key, but it was not where she indicated it would be in her note. So Edward went up to Mabel's room on the second floor. Her room was at the rear of the house, on the second floor, at the head of a flight of steps leading up from the living room. Her room had once been 2 rooms, so there were 2 doors opening from a narrow landing at the head of the stairs. When Edward got to the head of the stairs, he looked through the open door of Mabel's room and saw her body. Her feet were near the threshold, and she was dressed to go out with her hat on, but her dress skirt was off and thrown in a corner. Edward ran to the street and attracted the attention of some passers-by and sent them to Mrs. Bennet's house. You'll remember, she's the neighbor with the telephone. The local doctor, Dr. Frost, went to the house and summoned the medical examiner, Julian Mead, who arrived around 7 p.m. The medical examiner made a casual examination as there was no external hemorrhaging. All he noticed were the obviously mortal cuts across her throat. The medical examiner, Julian Mead, expressed the opinion that Mabel's death was a suicide, but he planned a more detailed exam the next day. Late that night, a little after 11 p.m., John Bruce, the undertaker, made the discovery that Mabel had been stabbed in the stomach and chest and in the back along with the cuts to her throat. Obviously, this was no suicide. It was noted that the wounds to the neck were inflicted after the death, as there was no flowing blood from those wounds. Further examination from the medical examiner determined that the wound in the center of the chest was 5 inches deep. The wound further down and the wound in her back were about 2.5 inches deep. Death was caused by a wound in the right ventricle of her heart. Because of the delay in determining the death was a homicide, police didn't get a case until more than 24 hours after the murder. Blame was put on the medical examiner, Dr. Mead. Prior to the police being called in, Harold, the brother, found a piece of paper from the same tablet lying on the floor of the living room that had the address J. L. Morton, Charlestown, Massachusetts. Police could not find a single enemy, and nothing of value was missing from the house from what they could tell. The note Mabel left for her father was written with a lead pencil. No pencil was found at the scene. Eventually, it was discovered that the murderer stole a $10 bill and 2 $1 bills, possibly more, from her purse, and there was a pin taken from Mabel's pincushion with a unique design on it. For several days, investigators had no suspect and no motive, and reasoned that the murder must have happened around 12 p.m. The murderer must have told Mabel that her brother was injured and in the hospital. She must have left the person downstairs while she went to dress after writing the note. The murderer crept upstairs, entered the room while she was adjusting the hat in the mirror, and attacked her. No weapon able to cause the wounds was kept at the Page home. It was determined that the skirt was torn from Mabel's body, as the hook and eye fasteners showed plainly that they went through a great strain, which was evidence she did not remove the skirt herself. Also, the belt around the body had the buckle wrenched from its ribbon. It pointed to the possibility that the assailant attempted to remove Mabel's clothing after she had fallen. One theory the police had was that her former fiancé was possibly involved, but that was quickly ruled out since he was happily married and it had been 15 years since they had even seen each other. Her father and brother were not suspects at all because they had not been near the house at the time of the murder. Whoever the murderer was, it must have been someone Mabel knew, otherwise she wouldn't have left the person downstairs while she changed. The murderer also probably didn't have much blood on them, since there was very little at the scene. Someone referred to only as a noted criminologist was interviewed for the paper. I thought this person had some interesting insights, more so because it was 1904, and the insights that they had seemed a little bit more from this time. I don't know. I found it interesting. The criminologist said that Mabel Page was killed by a man or a woman, degenerate, and that robbery was not the motive, and neither was hatred or revenge. The interview reads, "It is to be regretted that the primal examination by the medical examiner called in the case was so pronouncedly superficial. Viewing such a case as a problem to be solved by the skill of the ME and the police, a familiarity with the works of Whithouse and Becker and other experts would have prevented a careful examiner of making such a mistake." They're referring to the suicide designation. Whithouse and Becker wrote a book titled Medical Jurisprudence, Forensic Medicine and Toxicology, with the first edition being published in 1896. The interview continues. "It is possible to determine by the appearance of a wound whether it is of homicidal or suicidal in nature," he was asked. "Certainly, wounds in their own peculiar way have much to disclose. Any person familiar with the investigation of crime knows that there is a very distinct and unmistakable difference between wounds which have been self-inflicted and those inflicted by another. But suppose we digress for a moment for a bit of pertinent interjection. It may have been well established by gathered reports from France, Germany, England, and from the different states in our own country, that women, except in very rare instances, do not employ cutting weapons or firearms to commit suicide. The bearing of this on the Weston murder is that Miss Page was supposed to have killed herself by a method most unusual, you might say practically unknown, so far as female self-destroyers are concerned. Now, when it comes to the question of determining whether a wound in itself is self-inflicted or the result of an assault experience teaches that there is an easily determined difference. The cut of the assassin is bold and clean. There is no preliminary small cuts which speak unerringly of the shaky, uncertain, frightened hand of the suicide. Suicides, then, are likely to hesitate to the touch of a knife? Most assuredly. It hurts. They cannot help shrinking. It is human nature. Suicides who die by throat cut are almost invariably of the male sex, and according to writers on the subject, the immediate vicinity of the wounds is seldom without the preliminary cuts which bespeak hesitation and dread. Finally, when they get their courage screwed up to unshakable pitch, they give the deep, deadly slash. He went on to say the wounds were certainly homicidal, and that the murderer needed no anatomical knowledge. The criminologist also said that the person who inflicted the wounds knew the household, and that the perpetrator was in the house with Miss Page when the laundryman called, or he arrived very soon after. Because the maid, Miss Roberts, left the house precisely when she said she did, as corroborated by witnesses, and she didn't let anyone in the house, the window for someone to arrive would have been soon after Miss Roberts left, and either prior to the laundryman arriving or right after he left. Criminologists believed the attacker was known to the victim and let in the house and was present when Mabel wrote the note to her father. He further believed the attacker was allowed to wait downstairs while she went to get ready to leave the house, and most likely followed her to the room shortly later. The report stated that Mabel was wearing a picture hat when she was found dead. picture hat was an elaborate hat with a wide brim. It seems odd that she would put on a large hat prior to putting on her skirt. Finally, on April 3rd, a suspect emerged. The man lived within 2 miles of the Page home, and he was seen within 500 feet of the house at 12:15 the day of the murder. Mabel was believed to have been killed around 12. This man was the only person known to have been in the area and was seen walking calmly and leisurely towards the Page house from the direction of Auburndale. Between 1:30 and 2 p.m., he was seen on the way back from Auburndale and was agitated and nervous and ill at ease, and this was so noticeable that the people who saw him remarked how nervous and anxious he appeared. And this man knew the Page family, as he was well acquainted with Mabel's brother, Harold Page. No one would have suspected this person. There was no known motive, and no one saw him going into any house. The second time, he was walking briskly. He had a smooth face, dark clothes, a short dark overcoat, a black derby hat, and was around 5'7" and about 150 pounds. This person did not have a good reputation. He had not been convicted, but there were suspicions against him in the past year for several offenses. His name was Charles Tucker. Tucker was around 22 or 23 at the time of the murder. He was employed by a local boathouse, and while employed there, he was accused 2 separate times of stealing from the cash box. And he later admitted to forging his employer's signature on $1,500 in checks. The only reason he stayed out of jail was because Charles Tucker's father and his employer had a very close friendship. Then there's the death of his wife. On April 21st, 1903, almost a year prior to Mabel Page's murder, Tucker's wife brought him lunch while he was at work. Together they paddled out in a canoe onto the Charles River to have a picnic. At 2 p.m., Tucker returned an hour late and soaking wet, and explained that the canoe had capsized while he and his wife were changing seats, and she went in and drowned. I don't know if you have ever been in a canoe before, but I can tell you, I'd never attempt to switch seats in one unless I planned to capsize it and go in the water. The police didn't believe Tucker either, but there were no other witnesses. So that's the kind of guy we're talking about here. Real winner. There was a leather knife sheath turned over to the police by a gentleman of the name Arthur Woodward, who found the sheath on the seat of his grandfather's fish wagon. He told police that it belonged to Tucker, who left it behind after riding a short distance in the wagon during the early afternoon of March 31st. So police questioned Charles Tucker. He alone put himself within a 6 to 7 mile walk from the Page home, and he denied knowing Mabel at all. Significant evidence was found in the pocket of Tucker's coat. There they found 3 pieces of a broken knife blade. Tucker claimed he broke it on Tuesday. There was a substance found on the edges of the blade that appeared to be blood. And when fitted together, the pieces formed a blade that fit exactly into the sheath provided by Woodward. Also on the sheath were teeth marks where someone had been holding it with their teeth. Dentists did an impression of the upper and lower front teeth of Tucker, believing it may fit the indentations left on the sheath. They also found possible bloodstains on an old coat and a pair of gray trousers, which witnesses say Tucker wore on the day of the murder. Tucker did not try to conceal the knife blade. He didn't throw it in the river or bury it. He just broke it and then carried the pieces around in his pocket for 5 days after he was first interviewed by police. When confronted with the blade, Tucker made several claims about the knife. One, that it was lost months before, then finally admitted that he broke it because he thought the police were seeking to connect him to the murder and might use an innocent hunting knife against him. Tucker said he knew there were bloodstains on an old coat and trousers, and explained it by saying that he had been hunting squirrels, some time before and had carried the game home in his pockets. That's where I keep all of my game that I've hunted. I keep it in my pocket. And he knew Mabel, despite claiming otherwise. He had hunted with her brother and had been at the house several times. He even had gone to Harold's room, which meant that he walked past Mabel's room to get there. Overall, he appeared at ease and free from excitement as usual, according to witnesses. During his questioning all afternoon, he admitted to committing several minor offenses of which he was suspected but never charged. At this point, the police believed they had their murderer. This was the outline of their case. Tucker knew Mabel Page. She knew him well enough to believe any statement he made to her. She knew that he had formerly worked at the South Station, Boston, with her brother Harold. If her brother Harold had been injured, she believed Tucker, employed in the same building as her brother, would know about it. Tucker rang the front doorbell, intending to make a felonious assault upon a woman. That would be a rape. Because that was the real motive. When Mabel came to the door, Tucker told her that her brother had been injured and he was at the Massachusetts General Hospital. She was apparently greatly agitated. She told him she would go to Boston at once, as soon as she dressed. She allowed him to wait in the living room while she wrote the note to her father. It's believed that Tucker offered to accompany her to the electric car just across the Weston Bridge in Auburndale. That's why she let him sit in the living room. Tucker intended to wait until Mabel had removed at least her gown and skirts to dress for the street, but she dressed more quickly than Tucker thought, and he waited too long. He crept up the stairs, entered Mabel's room, and instead of finding her half-dressed, she was completely dressed and ready to leave, even wearing her hat. He sprang at her from behind, grabbed her, and tried to throw the slight woman down. Mabel resisted as vigorously as her frail stature would allow. Evidence seemed to show that Mabel was defending her honor with marvelous strength, and that she'd deleted his original purpose. The situation then became desperate because Mabel knew Tucker. Determined to assault her, he realized he needed to quiet his victim. With one arm holding her around the waist, he took the knife and sheath out of his pocket. He had to use his teeth to hold the sheath while he pulled the knife out. He gripped it so hard in his mouth that he left the teeth marks. Alarmed and enraged at the point of frenzy, he struck in rage and rapidly, so all wounds were inflicted in 2 to 3 minutes. He must have felt her body relax, so he released her, and the body fell to the floor. The passion of the assault was still rampant, so he began tugging at the skirt to remove the clothing, which interfered with his purpose. He did not stop to undo the clasp, he just tore the skirt off and threw it in the corner. Then he realized what he had done and cut her throat to make sure that she was dead. He drew the knife across her throat twice, severing the jugular on both sides. It's believed he went out the front door, ran to the rear of the house, and made his way across the field to Ridgeway Road, then across country to the next street, East Newton Street. From there, it's believed he went to the Boston and Albany railroad tracks and walked on the rail bed to the Riverside Station. From there, it's a short distance to Weston Bridge, where Tucker appeared between 1:15 and 1:30. At his arraignment, Charles Tucker pleaded not guilty, and the trial was set for January 2nd, 1905. At the trial, Tucker was described as smiling and debonair. He listened with indifference to Edward Page telling how he found his daughter dead. Edward Page said regarding finding Mabel, "On my return, I found the body of my daughter in her sleeping room on the second floor. The body was lying in the back, diagonally across the room, with the feet near the door. One arm was extended at right angles, the other with the hand up as if to protect the neck. I noticed the blood at the throat. I moved the hand away from the neck and I found a ragged wound that looked as if it had been made with a saw. I looked to see what the signs of death were. I felt of the hand. It was cold. I looked at the right hand and saw some little spots of blood on the fingers. I noticed that her skirt was raised to 3 to 4 inches above the knees. I pulled it down 5 to 6 inches, but it was difficult. It seemed to catch on the floor. My daughter did not have on her dress skirt. That was thrown on the floor. Then I went downstairs and saw a pad of paper lying on the table of the living room. One of the sheets of the pad had been torn off and lay beside the pad on the table. He looked at it and saw writing in lead pencil. That was the note Mabel had left about her brother. Tucker had no care about the medical examiner's testimony about stabs, cut throat, and cuts to her hands. But during the testimony of Chief Shaw of the state police, who was detailing conversations with Tucker, Tucker was paying attention before again assuming a posture of indifference. There were several experts in several sciences called as expert witnesses. Dr. Wood concluded that human blood was on the knife blade and on Tucker's coat. New testing was absolute, the blood was human. Tucker had been seen coming from the field between the Page estate and Ridgeway Road, described as smooth-faced and athletic, and dressed in dark clothes, wearing a derby hat. Harold told police of Tucker, "There is a man whom my sister would have believed no matter what message he brought." He said his sister knew Tucker well, and that Tucker had been to the Page home many times. On March 30th, 1905, Charles Tucker was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. There was a bit of a snafu after the trial when a woman went to the police in Brooklyn and said her husband was the J.L. Morton in the note found at the scene by Mabel's brother. The woman named Olive explained that her husband, John Archibald McIsaacs, used the alias J.L. Morton when he had worked as a barber in Boston. About 2 days after the murder, McIsaacs returned from an out-of-town trip, told his wife, "Well, we done the Page case all right." McIsaacs was arrested. His wife again repeated in front of her husband the claim, causing her husband to grow pale. It was learned that Olive had filed assault charges against her husband. When she was asked to repeat her statement to the Massachusetts State Police about the Page murder, she said she had never made any such statement. It turns out Olive was fascinated by Charles Tucker and used the story as a way to get revenge against her abusive husband. On June 12, 1906, after his last appeal was rejected, Tucker died in the electric chair. He read a statement before that said, "I hope that God will forgive me for all the wrongs I have ever done in my past life. I forgive everybody who has ever wronged me. I am at peace with my Maker. May God have mercy on my soul." The electricity had to be applied 3 times before Tucker died. As we close the chapter on Mabel Page's tragic story from 1904, we're left with lingering questions and the haunting echoes of a life cut short. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the past. If you liked what you heard, please tell all your friends and give us a 5-star review if you have a chance. Catch every spine-chilling episode on all major podcast platforms, or dive deeper at lurkpodcast.com, where you'll find episodes, social media links, and our blog. Stay curious, stay cautious, and until next time, keep lurking.